In 1878, in the heart of Victorian London, photographer William Harris made a horrifying discovery. When he developed his latest commission, a portrait of a grieving family beside their deceased daughter, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible in the shadows, stood another child. A child he had never photographed. A child whose face he would soon recognize from a newspaper clipping about a fire that had consumed a workhouse 20 years earlier. This is the true story of the photographer who captured more than the dead, and the nightmare that unfolded when the past refused to stay buried. William Harris had built his reputation on sensitivity and artistry. In an era when death was ever present, when families lost children to disease, accident, and poverty with heartbreaking frequency, post-mortem photography offered something precious: a final memory, a last portrait, proof that a beloved child had existed at all. Harris understood grief. He worked quickly, respectfully, positioning the deceased with care, sometimes painting open eyes onto closed lids in the final print, creating the illusion of peaceful sleep rather than eternal rest. His studio on Wych Street occupied the ground floor of a narrow building that leaned slightly to one side, as if exhausted by the weight of London's smog and sorrow. The upper floors had been converted into his darkroom and living quarters. The location was convenient, affordable, and something he tried not to think about too deeply. The building stood on the ruins of the Mercy Hill Workhouse for children, which had burned to the ground in 1858, 20 years before our story begins. 43 children had perished in that fire. The newspapers had called it a tragedy. The survivors had called it something else entirely. It began with the Morrison family in late October of 1878. Their daughter, Elizabeth, just 7 years old, had succumbed to scarlet fever. Harris photographed her lying in a small white coffin, surrounded by flowers, her parents standing rigid with grief on either side. It was a standard commission, somber but straightforward. But when Harris developed the glass plate negative in his darkroom that evening, he noticed an anomaly in the background. Near the studio's back wall, partially obscured by the velvet curtain he used as a backdrop, there appeared to be another figure. A small figure. A child. Harris assumed it was a flaw in the plate, perhaps a double exposure, though he prided himself on never making such amateur mistakes. He made a note to inspect his equipment and thought nothing more of it, until the Winters family 2 weeks later. Their son, Thomas, had drowned in the Thames. Another tragic portrait, another development session, and there, in the corner of the image, stood the same shadowy child. This time, the figure was clearer, closer to the camera. Harris could make out a ragged dress, tangled hair, and something about the face that seemed wrong, though he couldn't quite articulate what disturbed him. He began to investigate. Harris pulled out his records, matching negative plates with final prints from the past 6 months. To his growing horror, he found the figure in 17 different photographs, always in the background, always slightly clearer than the time before, always edging closer to the subjects of his portraits. But here was the truly disturbing part. The figure only appeared in photographs of children, never adults, only the young dead. Harris became obsessed. He researched the history of his building, visiting the London Metropolitan Archives, combing through old newspapers on yellowed microfilm. The Mercy Hill Workhouse fire of 1858 had been thoroughly documented. 43 children dead, most under the age of 12. The fire had started in the basement, in the sleeping quarters where the youngest children were kept. The doors had been locked from the outside. The matron, a Mrs. Edith Crawley, claimed it was for the children's safety, to prevent them from wandering at night. The inquiry had ruled it a tragic accident, though several survivors testified that they had heard the children screaming, that they had heard Mrs. Crawley refuse to unlock the doors, that she had said the fire was God's judgment on the wicked and ungrateful. Mrs. Crawley herself had perished in the fire, struck by a falling beam as she fled the building. Her body had been found near the locked basement door, the key still clutched in her charred hand. The survivors spoke of one girl in particular, a child named Mary Wickham, who had been Mrs. Crawley's favorite target for punishment. Mary had been locked in the basement coal cellar for days at a time, given only bread and water, made to sleep on the cold stone floor. On the night of the fire, witnesses claimed they heard Mary's voice above all others, screaming not for help, but screaming Mrs. Crawley's name, over and over, like a curse. Harris found a surviving photograph of the Mercy Hill Workhouse children, taken just 3 months before the fire. It was a group portrait, stiff and formal, the children arranged in rows. And there, in the back row, he found her, Mary Wickham. He recognized her immediately. The tangled hair, the hollow eyes, the expression of barely contained rage. She was the figure in his photographs. She was the child who had been appearing, image by image, getting closer to his subjects. But the nightmare was only beginning. Harris's next commission arrived on a cold November morning. The Ashworth family had lost their daughter, Margaret, to pneumonia. As Harris prepared his equipment, he felt a creeping sensation of dread. The studio seemed colder than usual. The shadows in the corners appeared deeper, more solid. And as he positioned young Margaret in her coffin, arranging her hands, smoothing her hair, he felt certain that he was being watched. He took the photograph quickly, his hands shaking as he handled the plate. That night, when he developed the image, his worst fears were confirmed. Mary Wickham stood directly behind the coffin now, clearly visible, her hand reaching toward the dead child. And for the first time, Harris could see her face in perfect detail. Her eyes were burned, empty sockets that seemed to stare directly at the camera. Her mouth was open in a silent scream. And her clothes, he realized with mounting horror, were still smoking, as if the fire had never truly ended for her. Harris stopped taking commissions. He locked himself in his studio, surrounded by the 17 photographs, studying them obsessively. He noticed something he had missed before. In each image, Mary Wickham wasn't just present. She was taking something. In the earliest photographs, it was subtle, almost invisible. But in the later images, he could see a faint trail of light, like gossamer thread, connecting Mary's outstretched hand to the deceased child's chest. She was taking something from them, harvesting something. But what and why? The answer came from an unexpected source. An elderly woman appeared at Harris's door in early December, introducing herself as Sarah Pembroke, one of the survivors of the Mercy Hill fire. She had seen Harris's name in the newspaper, advertising his photography services, and recognized the address. She had come to warn him. Sarah explained that Mary Wickham had been different from the other children. She had been born in the workhouse, had never known any life beyond those walls, had endured Mrs. Crawley's cruelty from her earliest memories. On the night of the fire, as the flames consumed the building, Mary had made a terrible vow. She would never leave. She would haunt the ground where she had suffered, and she would take from the dead what had been stolen from her in life. Childhood itself, innocence, peace. Harris asked what he should do. Sarah's answer was chilling. There was nothing he could do. Mary was bound to that place, feeding on the energy of young death, growing stronger with each photograph, each captured soul. The only way to stop her, Sarah claimed, was to give her what she wanted: acknowledgement, recognition, proof that her suffering had mattered. Harris had to photograph her deliberately, make her the subject rather than the shadow, and then destroy the plate in fire, releasing her spirit the same way it had been trapped. On the winter solstice of 1878, William Harris prepared his camera for one final photograph. He set up his equipment in the exact center of his studio, where the basement door of the old workhouse had once stood. He used no subject, no corpse, no grieving family. Just an empty chair, positioned where Mary Wickham had died 70 years after her time, calling out in anguish. He opened the shutter and waited. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the windows, and Mary Wickham appeared, not as a shadow or a blur, but as solid and real as any living child. She sat in the chair, her burned face turned toward the camera, her hollow eyes fixed on Harris. He could hear her now, a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She spoke of cold nights and hunger, of Mrs. Crawley's punishments, of the smell of smoke and the sound of children screaming. She spoke of 20 years of wandering, invisible, forgotten, stealing fragments of peace from the newly dead because she had never known peace herself. Harris closed the shutter. He developed the plate with shaking hands, and when he pulled it from the chemical bath, he saw the clearest, most detailed photograph he had ever created. Mary Wickham captured perfectly every detail of her suffering, visible in heartbreaking clarity. He wrapped the plate in cloth, carried it to his fireplace, and placed it in the flames. The plate cracked with a sound like a child's scream. The fire blazed white hot, then suddenly went out, leaving the room in complete darkness. When Harris lit a lamp, the studio felt different, warmer, emptier. He never saw Mary Wickham again, but he also never took another post-mortem photograph. He closed his studio, moved to the countryside, and spent the rest of his life photographing landscapes, flowers, anything alive and growing toward the light. The building on Wych Street was demolished in 1901 to make way for the Aldwych development. Workers reported unusual difficulties during the demolition, equipment malfunctions, and strange cold spots in the basement. One worker claimed he saw a young girl watching from the ruins, but when he called out to her, she vanished like smoke. The 17 photographs William Harris took, the ones containing Mary Wickham's image, were donated to the London Metropolitan Archives after his death in 1923. They remain there today, filed under Victorian post-mortem photography, unknown anomalies. And if you look closely at those images, if you study the shadows in the corners, you might still see her, watching, waiting, wondering if anyone will remember her name. The question we must ask ourselves is this: how many ghosts walk among us, not because they choose to haunt, but because we have forgotten to mourn them? How many Mary Wickhams linger in the places of their suffering, invisible, voiceless, desperate for someone to simply acknowledge that they existed, that their pain mattered, that their short lives were worth remembering? The dead, it seems, do not rest easily when they have been erased from history. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about this story is not the ghost in the photograph, but the realization that our own indifference to suffering can create the very hauntings we fear.